Once upon a time there were two little girls named Deb. One little girl grew up to be a preacher while the other grew up to be a pagan, and they both grew up to be the very best of friends. Join the preacher and the pagan as they take a fresh look at Christianity, from the inside out and the outside in.
Hello, hello, hello. Good morning.
Hey.
Oh my gosh. I don't know what's dragging more, me or my computer.
Well, you got a bit of a heat thing going on there, so you can both be forgiven.
Oh, yeah. Hello. Welcome from the surface of Venus. Okay, I'm sorry. It's more the bright side of Mercury. It's not as humid as Venus. So
Well, there you go. There you go. So today we're going to have fun, eh?
it's the word salad episode.
It is. We were talking about what we can do for another episode, and we've got a bunch of ideas, but I've got to go do some research for a lot of them. So I was going back and looking at what we've
Wait,
covered, and
you,
we've
you,
covered
you do
every myth,
research for these
but
episodes?
of course I do. I'm not going to just spout garbage and let our listeners think that something is when it isn't. I do
That's my
research.
whole spouting garbage. Okay, sorry. Speaking of word salad,
Fair enough. Yeah. So we're looking at Babel, the Tower of Babel story at the Genesis 11, which is the last story that we include in what we call the Judeo-Christian myths
mhm.
in the first Genesis. Yeah. So it's kind of fun. It's overlooked by a lot of folks, but it's actually a fun story for a few reasons.
So here's a question for you. You
Hmm.
say Babel. I always thought it was Babel.
Potato, potato.
Okay. Well, Babel sounds more like babbling, so yeah, I can see where we're getting that from, but it's all
Yep.
good. Yeah.
Yep. In fact, the language learning program, Babel or Babel, however you pronounce it, is actually named after this story.
Yes, I knew that.
Oh,
As
good. I did
as
not.
as is, if I'm going to inject some nerdy,
Hmm.
the little fish they put in your ear in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Yes,
The
I saw that.
translation, the Babel fish.
Yeah, I saw that. That is just too funny. You
I
know
mean,
what?
we're so
This is why
nerdy.
even people who do not want to believe this as a faith really should understand the culture of it, because all these little nuggets are everywhere in our society. It's replete. It's fun.
The more nerdy we can get this, the happier I'll be. Because like I one of my all-time favorite podcasts is something called The History of English. I couldn't get through the whole thing because frankly I have ADHD and I just couldn't make the commitment to thousands of years of language. But it basically goes back to the Proto-Indo-European roots of the English language all the way through modern English. There is an entire episode on the letter C.
Oh, I
It
can
was
believe
my
it.
favorite episode.
Yep.
So language is insanely complex,
It
and
is. It
the
is. And
history
you
of it is
never know where
insanely
you're going to
complex.
borrow. Yeah.
So,
You never know who's going to borrow from what. So for anybody getting up to date on what the story of the Tower of Babel is, because it's just not talked about that much. Essentially, humans decide they're going to build a city, and in the middle of that city, there's going to be a tower, and they are convinced they're going to build it to God, and they're going to make a name for themselves. And meanwhile, God's watching this and saying, "Yeah, yeah, I don't think so," and knocks it
nope.
down and takes away their common language, so they're all speaking different languages, and then they spread out um, through the world after that.
Yeah. So
So it's really neat. Anytime I'm telling people to read these stories, I tell them, think about sitting around a campfire and it's dark out and you can hear the nature rustling as it settles in for the night, and the fire is sparking and you can see the stars in the sky, and someone says, Grammaire, why do people read all these languages? And then the story begins. And that is the best way, in my opinion, to read the the first 11 chapters of Genesis, because it's all about explaining why the world is the way it is to a people who are pre-literate and pre-scientific.
So you're telling me the entire first section of Genesis is basically ancient urban legends?
Pretty much. Yeah,
Well, not urban.
not urban, no, definitely not. But it's beautifully written myth, and it corresponds with so many myths around the world. I mean,
Mhm.
Aztecs, the Ural. I mean, cultures that never would have engaged
Right.
have similar stories. And one of the
Well,
things that really,
unless the aliens help them.
well, there's always that theory.
There
But
is.
I mean, it always bugs me when people keep saying, "Oh, well, the Bible copied here." It's like we're talking intermingling of ancient cultures who all copied each other. You can't find where the origin is of any of them. So suck it up, Buttercup, and realize that the Bible is just as ancient and just as legitimate. It just happens to be better preserved because
Yeah.
we just happen to be the culture that won.
Honestly, that's the truth. And one of the things, and because I'll be honest with you, when I was younger, I was really not a history buff. I thought history was kind of dull. But that was because nobody knew how to teach it to me.
Well,
I needed
yeah.
I needed the dirt, I needed the gossip, I needed the stuff, right? Oh
Mm-hmm.
my God. The reason I hated history when I was younger was history is enormously complex. It is,
Yep.
I mean, there is, whenever I hear somebody talk about, well, they just stole that, my first thought is, oh, lazy history.
That's exactly it. So to
And
get to some of the really fun ancient conspiracy about this is they think that the city in the tower that's talking about the Tower of Babel is actually the city of Babylon, because in Hebrew scriptures, Babel is what they call Babylon. And when this was being written, it was being written by, or edited by at least, the priestly class that were in exile just southeast of Babylon, who would have been picking up a lot of things. And Babylon would have been the center of their world for a lot of reasons, probably even more so practically than Jerusalem was.
wasn't it a much older civilization than
I, I don't know
Judea?
if I'd say older, but it's see that the origins of the whole
The
Hebrew
region is
society is
very
a little.
complex.
Well, exactly,
Yeah.
and we're talking about cultures that have fed into each other for
Mhm.
like ridiculous amounts of time,
Thousands of years.
all prehistoric, which means pre-written.
Oh my
So
God.
we will get like we can look to statuary, carvings, maybe. Um, it's believed that if we have to identify older, then yeah, the Babylonian, the whole Mesopotamian and Fertile Crescent kind of thing is the oldest part of people. But
That's
Jerusalem's really
not
not that
true.
far as the crow flies.
And that is no longer true with
Well, yeah, I know.
the
Yeah.
discovery of Göbekli Tepe and all those places.
Well, precisely.
So,
But we
don't get
one of
me
the
on.
things the
Let's not go down
Middle
that
East.
rabbit
No,
hole
no,
because that is my hyper fixation right now.
that's okay. No, but we were talking about historic peoples, and I'm using that in the academic word, meaning people who have written histories.
Okay.
They more or less originate between Egypt and um, Mesopotamia and Babylon into Persia. So all of those languages are actually the oldest languages written down that we are aware of. And that's not the spoken language. Spoken languages are older, but the written languages come from that
Exactly.
region. So there's a whole lot of intermingling of ideas and stories and language and thoughts and whatever. So it's like trying to unravel a tapestry that's really densely made. Like
So
good luck on finding the first string.
yeah, basically, they may not have written they may not have sold the first thing, but they kept the receipts, you know.
Yeah, yeah,
And we can read the receipts from them literally. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, and the whole idea of a myth of people trying to reach God and become like God and make their name as these people that have finally reached the top. And every culture in the world
Yep.
has a story similar to it. That's one of the reasons why the Greeks built temples on top of mountains, because they
Yep.
believed that was closer to God. And you will love this. Of all the various places, I mean, there's Mexican myths, there's Nepali myths, there's
Mhm.
Botswana myths. There is an Arizona myth
Of course there is.
about Montezuma,
Mhm.
um, who had escaped the flood,
Mhm.
but when people tried to reach um, the Great Spirit through thunderbolts down, and one of the things unique about that is that they crushed the heads of the people below.
Okay
So
then.
that's like the most one of the more violent versions
Oh,
of this theme
it,
of
it,
story. I thought you'd
it's
appreciate
actually kind
that.
of funny you mentioned that because I'm like I said, my our ancient archaeology is now my current one of my hyper focuses, and the pyramids in that place, Egypt, yes,
Mhm.
when they worshipped the older gods, the Egyptian tombs for kings were buried underground. It wasn't until they started worshiping the sun god Ra that they started building their tombs upward to try to be
Mhm.
closer to God.
Yep.
So that was when they went from underground tombs, because the oldest tombs in Egypt are actually underground. They didn't
Mhm.
start building the temples until they started worshiping the sun.
Yep. Yeah.
I love that kind of stuff because
Yep.
you don't learn that in regular history. You have
No.
to look for that kind of stuff. You've got to actually be interested and curious. And too many people are not curious anymore. They just don't care.
Well, they're also not taught that history is worthy of learning and studying more.
And
They're lost. Most
well,
people, as they mature, they realize, wait a minute, history's got something here. So let's dig into that a little bit more.
well, and I think one of the biggest things with history, it's the same with language, you have to learn to be, as one scientist put it, content with the questions.
Yes.
Because if you need solid answers, no discipline is ever going to satisfy
No.
you. It's always going to frustrate you because
Yep.
the nature of reality has changed. The more we learn, the more we know, the more things evolve. And
Yep. Well, and the more questions emerge.
exactly. And that's why it's so much easier to think that, well, we built a tower and God broke us down, and that's why we have languages rather than follow
Mhm.
100,000 years of Indo-European migration or
Right. But
10,000 years,
but when this story would have been told originally, they had none of that background. So
Exactly.
it made complete sense. And
Well,
it's actually kind of beautiful when you think about it, because there's no sense that any culture is more important than another.
exactly.
Everybody, the whole story is that everybody spoke the same language and they all concentrated in one area. And give them props for picking Babylon and Mesopotamia as where people went. I mean, yeah, it's their geography, but history bears that out a little bit too.
But
um
in their culture, they would, I mean, we know that the cities of Europe are older than the cities of North America. We
mhm,
know that you go to Egypt, you're going to find stuff older than than if you go to even Europe usually. And the
yep,
reason we know that is because there are, even back then, there was trade. There were people on those trade
yep,
routes traveling to these places, telling these stories. And they
yep,
were an ancient culture. They were greedy for any stories they could get.
mhm,
So, yeah, they would have known this. They may not have known the specifics, but
right,
it's
yep,
just the way we do. With the information we know, we tell stories. Our
mhm,
scientists tell stories. Our politicians tell stories. Our storytellers tell stories, and it's all based
mhm,
on what we know.
exactly. Exactly. And it's a fantastic metaphor because if you, one of the I won't say hidden, but one of the secondary meaning, your story parts and all of this, because, any good story has the A line and the B line. The B line in all of this is that humans want to make a name for themselves, and that is thwarted. And there's one scholar I was reading, they said, if you really look through the Hebrew gospel, the people whose names we come up with, Samuel, Esther, Purah, I mean, all of these people didn't set out to make a name for themselves. They just wanted to make something better or have a relationship or do the just thing. And they're held up. Whereas those who are basically megalomaniacs and are only obsessed about having their own identity, they're stopped. History forgets them. And I thought, how do we put that parallel? Because I love taking the parallel from the ancient culture and putting it into a modern context. And I was thinking about so many places, like we have people obsessed with making names themselves. And I mean, your culture is particular that it's got this whole self-made man myth. We don't have that.
The Horatio Alger myth.
Yeah, we don't have that here as a cultural myth, the way you folks do. But the promise in the story of Babel is that these people are forgotten. They do not make the impact that they think they make.
And they are not even allowed to tell their own side of the story because language has been shot.
Well, yeah. But I'm thinking, but the megalomaniacs in our era, like how many of them are going to be going down in history? I mean, they're going to be footnotes. They're going to be people that might get a scholarly look at it. But I mean, think of some of the hideous people 100 years ago. Like, we don't know who they are. And that's only a few generations.
I mean, we know some, you might hear in US history that, Andrew Jackson was a horrible person, but you don't remember why.
Precisely. Yeah. Yeah. And like you might have a name, but you don't have their story.
What is the Greek myth of the guy who built the wax wings and flew too close to the sun? I know, I can't remember. His name is escaping me, but that's like hubris. It's there's always a warning against hubris, which is this completely undeserved self-confidence, And that's the thing about a lot of these older stories. They're all designed to teach us in some ways, and that's what the whole purpose of the storytelling, around the campfire would be to teach us these important truths. Icarus, thank you. Oh my God, I would have lost sleep tonight.
Yeah, well, you can thank the god. You can thank the gods of Google for that one.
And okay, I'm just going to nerd for a moment because I have to say it. Google is actually based on a word. Do you know what a real Google is? It's just spelled differently. It's spelled Googol. Google is a number. It's the number 1 followed by 100 zeros.
Really?
And there is another number even larger called a Googleplex, which is a 1 followed by a Google of zeros.
Wow.
But Google is a Googol. The weird stuff that's stuck in my brain hole. It's not even funny. But when Google first came out, the first thing I thought of was, it's based on Google. People will think that's cool. Nobody knows.
Yeah, that happens when you nerd about a certain thing.
I know. So anyway, back to the Tower of Babel, or Babel, or whatever you want to call it.
Whatever.
So these people, is there any context around? Did they just wake up one day and say, let's build a tower to God?
Yeah, pretty much. That's the essentially the beginning of the story, that they just decide, you know what, we've got the technology, let's build a city, and we'll build a tower in the city, and the tower will go high enough to get to God.
Oh, like,
Yeah,
yeah, the
there's no
technology. Let's
there's
build our AI overlords.
precisely, yeah, like there's no lead up to the story. Now this just comes after quite an extensive story about Noah, and and the whole rainbow and the salvation of people and the new starts, and then the genealogies of Noah, and then we get into Babel. So one of the other things, if you want to call it the seed line of this story, is that God had already given these people the instructions to go out and subdue is such an awful word, but that's the word. Go out and subdue the earth, basically spread out everywhere. And they didn't. And they stayed together, and they all spoke the same language, and, and all got involved in the same project. And this is where God says, no, not going to happen. So then God intervenes, and they can't talk to each other because they're all confused, and they sound like they're babbling to each other.
So basically, in essence, what you're saying is the story of Babel is, in essence, God giving humanity a big old timeout and sending us all to our own corners because we didn't follow instructions.
Pretty much. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And hidden in all of that, of course, is the whole concept of free will. It's like, you know what? You had your chance. So, you know what? I'm adapting the playing field, and this is how we're going to do this going forward. Um, yeah, it was kind of, and people are not told where to go. And as I said, there's no one culture that is given superiority over the others. There are just a whole lot of confused people, which is what the word Babel means, is confusion. And they just go off in their family groups and to wherever, and that's kind of the end of the story.
Now, is there any actual historical or archaeological um reference point that may have served as an inspiration for this story? Any destruction of
Potentially,
a major culture where the people had to disperse?
there potentially is. Now, when we're talking about the culture of Babylon itself, now remember, this is where the priests edited it. They didn't write the original story, but they edited it while in exile in
Mm-hmm.
Babylonian territory. So they would have been there with people from other cultures, and they would not have been the only one exiled into Babylon. Now there is a very similar myth in Babylonian tradition, and I'm will totally destroy the name, so I'm not going to try too hard. But essentially, the myth is that they wanted to build a massive ziggurat in Eridu, and brought in all these treasures and whatever to make it. And people who were not impressed with this prayed to their gods, and those gods destroyed the temple. But there is still a physical ziggurat, or the remnants of where a ziggurat would have been in Babylon. So that could have led to the story as well.
Okay. Or
Fleshed it out a little bit.
could have also been, a faulty foundation or an
Oh,
earthquake, or
absolutely.
but
Yeah.
like, let's just say God struck it down. That'll work too.
Well, sure. And I mean, and these people knew their math. They knew what they were doing. They knew what they were
Mhm,
building. But I
exactly.
mean, if you've ever stood on the ground and then been in an airplane, you realize there's a whole lot of more air there than you realize. And so
Exactly.
that could have been something, it could have been as simple as, we've got this idea, let's do it. It's like, okay, we're up 100 feet and we're not anywhere closer than we thought we were going to be. Like, just scrap it and call it a day. We run out of resources, or any number of logical reasons.
Mhm.
And these things develop their own mythologies after a while.
Well, yeah, and everything develops its own mythology if it
Mhm.
hangs around long enough,
Precisely. Yeah.
you know. But I love this, that I think, honestly, knowing that there are there are potentially real world inspirations. I don't want to say
Mhm.
explanations because that's not appropriate,
No,
but
no, but inspiration is
inspirations
good.
for these myths.
Hmm.
It makes them more meaningful to me. It makes them more interesting because
Yep.
we're doing that all the time. We are as a culture, not and not even as a culture, as a species, we are myth makers. We try to understand the data that is being poured into our poor little weak brains. We
Hmm.
try to interpret it into something that makes sense to us. We do that literally every second of our lives. People don't fathom that. They think there is something out there that is tangible. No, everything that exists, our brains are putting together and interpreting for us.
Well, it's the basic hook metaphor, right? If you've already got hooks, it's so much easier to put something on it than if you have to create the hook in the first place.
Exactly.
And the thing also that as a spiritual person that's underlying this is the desire for humanity to touch the divine
Yes.
in every culture around the world. And what is that going to look like? And the desire of some who are more self-centered than others, who want to do that for their own acclaim or do
Mhm.
something. I mean, we were just recently off of a lost submarine because people with that level of hubris decided they had to go someplace and make a name for themselves. So we have not lost that element in our society that wants these grand projects for their own namesake. And
Mhm.
if you look at Babel as a precautionary tale, um, it's not going to work.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean they're not going to
Um,
try again, but it doesn't.
oh
But it
yes.
doesn't work.
In the current pop culture metaphor, there are people like Zuckerberg,
Mm.
Elon Musk,
Yeah.
these people who are they have more money than sense sometimes, you know.
Hmm. Well, yeah, and they're going to be lost through time. Like no one's going to remember their names,
No,
and and
and
that's
that
just.
probably keeps them up at night.
Oh, yeah, I'm probably sure it is. But but it's the same. It's the same desire to make a lasting statement. There's a getting back to Babylon and there is a large rock. It was erected after the Persians invaded the Babylonians, and I cannot remember the name of the king, but basically he says, "I am king, blah blah."
Ozymandias.
Azamedia, that's it. And look at this, what I have created, and fear me.
Yep.
And there is nothing around.
See,
And that, I mean, that level of desire to be significant long after they're dead, it just, this Babel story helps us remember that that's not why people are remembered.
I
I mean,
am.
they may be remembered by their family, but 2 and 3 generations,
Yeah,
and even that
you're a
memory's gone.
generation or two from oblivion.
Yeah,
It's the hardest thing for people to understand.
yeah.
And once you embrace that, it's like life is so much easier. You're like,
Mm.
we're little bits. And I have to tell you, I'm not a big poetry fan. I'm really woefully inadequate as in my knowledge of poetry, but my favorite poem of all time is Ozymandias by Percy Beer Shelley, I believe it is. It's either Shelley or Keats who wrote it. Have you ever
Mm.
read the poem?
No, think I'm worse on poetry than you are.
Look it up. Just look up the poem Ozymandias, and it's
Hmm.
literally the only poem that I remember the theme of so well that I pulled that name right out of my head because I love that poem so
Mm,
much.
yeah, that was good.
So, but yeah, I mean, and the thing is, as there, I don't want to get all existential on you, but the reality is if you look at what current scientific theory is, everything is chaos,
Hmm.
everything is
Yep.
insubstantial, and the existential trauma of realizing that everything is fluid and
Hmm.
impermanent. we have to deal with that as a culture. And we've been dealing with that for a lot longer than we've known about quantum physics, you know?
Oh, absolutely. No, it's instinct. Same the same instinct that makes us want to touch God, that makes some people want to create monuments so they can actually get there, is the same
It's
kind
a
of
fear of
impetus to,
oblivion.
yeah, and precisely. And the again, if you're looking at the Tower of Babel as just strictly mythology, I mean, it's fun. It's got your various lines of stories, but if you're looking for it as a wisdom tale, um, don't look for to try to create your own legacy. Look for a life that matters, and your legacy will be created in your memory.
Oh, God, that's beautiful. Thank
Thank you. I
you.
get paid by the word.
Well, you keep waiting on that check, honey. It's gonna come,
Lots
I
of zeros,
promise.
lots of zeros.
Oh my gosh. Well, I think we are running out of time, and I
We are.
that was such a beautiful thing to end on. So I'm just gonna go ahead. I love this conversation. I wish we could talk about it for another hour, but we are
Mm,
time limited here.
we are indeed. But it's been
So
fun.
it
This
has
has been
been, and I
great.
can't wait to do some more with you. This is our 21st episode. You realize that, right?
I know. It's
I know,
wild
I'm
when I think about
excited.
it.
And
Yep.
I finally figured out a way to get all of these episodes up on YouTube. So if you know someone who wants to listen to the episodes, but they can't do the podcast thing, but they are like addicted to YouTube, we do have a YouTube channel. It is under The Preacher and the Pagan. If you search The Preacher and the Pagan, you will find all of our episodes there. So I'm pretty excited about that.
Yeah, that's great.
Because it was a nightmare, and I finally found a site that makes it really easy to translate them from audio to video. So, yay.
Technology can be your friend.
Oh, I'm so glad there are nerds out there smarter than me. Thank you, nerds. We appreciate you. Uh, so, I am, until next time, my friend.
Absolutely.
Okay. Deb Suttard in Canada, and I am Deb Bodwin in sunny Arizona, USA. Um, any words of wisdom before we go, my friends?
Stay cool.
Stay cool. Good luck with that. Okay.
Yes.
Bye-bye. Thank you all
Yeah.
for
Bye,
joining us
hon.
on The Preacher and the Pagan.
Yeah. Bye all.
Bye.
You've been listening to The Preacher and the Pagan with Deborah Suttard and Deborah Bodwin. This podcast is a two-lady podcast production in conjunction with The Barefoot Evangelist. Our producer and sound editor is Catherine Gordon. Our theme music was composed by Deborah Bodwin. You can reach us at thepreacherandthepagan@gmail.com or by visiting our website at barefootevangelist.ca/podcast.